She had the Spirit. Holy Spirit, wanna welcome in this place. Holy Spirit, wanna welcome in this place. And he did lead her right up to Freedom, all the way up north to Philadelphia. And if you want to hear the rest of the story, I'll see you tomorrow. God bless you.
Thank you, Sister Anita. Amen. We're certainly delighted to have with us tonight Dr. Edda Fields Black. And she is of age and she will introduce herself. We want to hear all that she has to share with us. What a unique journey she has been on, delving deep into the rice fields of this area and in Africa. And then delving deep down into the plantations along the Combee River. And that's where her roots go. Her families came out of that area. I hadn't known her that long. I've known her about 10 years, but with most of her first cousins, we all started first grade together a little over 60 years ago. And I know them all well. I have been fascinated with the work that she has been doing, how she has delved into the pension files of many of those persons who fought in the Combee River Raid and others who were liberated and enlisted after the raid. She will share with us what she has done and what she has gleaned. Let us receive now Dr. Edda Fields Black.
Thank you, Reverend Hodges. Thank you, everyone. Thanks for coming out this afternoon. It is a pleasure and it's an honor to be here. I want to thank Reverend Hodges and Tabernacle Baptist Church. I want to thank Reverend Hodges for his vision and his leadership. And his perseverance to bring this Harriet Tubman monument to downtown Beaufort and to bring it to fruition. I can only imagine the challenges he has faced, the obstacles. I can only imagine. And we are so blessed that he overcame and he did not stop and he did not give up. And tomorrow, the monument will be unveiled and Harriet Tubman will be honored here in Beaufort, where she served the U.S. Army, Department of the South, and where she led the largest slave revolt in U.S. history. Thank you, Reverend Hodges. And I also must thank Reverend Hodges for his support over the years. Every rice field I planted, every rice pot I cooked up, Reverend Hodges was there. And he did go to school with my cousins. My cousins who are in Colleton, the Fields family, as well as cousin Cleveland Frazier, who's now in Charleston. So it's a small world in the corridor. It's a small world. Even when you're born and raised in Miami, Florida, as I was, you know, I'm just one step removed from my grandparents and my dad, who were born right here in Green Pond, South Carolina. So I am going to try to get through this today without crying. I feel so blessed to be here. I feel so blessed to be the vehicle, and I'm just the vehicle through which this story is told. I am so blessed to have been chosen. I'm blessed to have been given the responsibility. I won't say that I stumbled upon the Combee River Raid, because that's not true. I stumbled upon the records through which I'm telling this story, which have not been used before by historians, as I was looking for my family. And I'm going to talk about that. I was literally minding my business, as we say. And I knew that our family patriarch had given me something to do, which was take care of a cemetery in Green Pond right before he passed away. Nobody knew. I don't know that we knew at the time that he had cancer. We didn't know that he was the only one who knew who was buried in that cemetery, the Fields family. He didn't know the condition the cemetery was in, but he sent me there. And over a period of time, that sent me looking for the Fields family, who I thought were from Whitehall, because that's where Daddy was born, and that's where the family lives now. But I found out they were from Beaufort. And I found out that Hector Fields, who was our oldest known ancestor, well, at the time, served in the 2nd South Carolina Volunteers. So much of this story for me was about finding Hector. And in finding Hector, great-great-great-grandfather Hector, I found the pension files, I found the testimony of the Combee freedom seekers, and I found that I had a story to tell about Harriet Tubman's life that hadn't been told before. So I'm going to talk a little bit about that today. And tomorrow, as the unveiling is happening, begins the anniversary of the Combee River Raid, right? June 1st and June 2nd of 1863. When Harriet Tubman and her group of spies, scouts, and pilots piloted Colonel James Montgomery, who was the commander of the 2nd South Carolina Volunteers, and those, of course, were black soldiers, and I'll talk more about them, and one company of the 3rd Rhode Island Heavy Artillery, who were white soldiers, up the sleepy, serpentine Combee River, and they burned 7 rice plantations to the ground and rescued 756 enslaved people. And as I've said, and as I argue in Combee, this was the largest slave revolt in U.S. history. And it's second only in the history of the entire New World to the Haitian Revolution, the largest and most successful. So since we're in Beaufort, we all probably know about the Battle of Port Royal. And I think the Combee River Raid really began with the Battle of Port Royal, right? The U.S. Navy drove its armada up Port Royal Sound, and the planters and slaveholders fled, the great skedaddle, And they tried to take enslaved people, some of them with them, particularly house slaves, but also prime field hands, depending on where they were going and what their needs were going to be. And the black people who could hid in the woods and in the swamps and in the fields. They just hid until the white people left. And so the white folks remember it as the Great Skedaddle. The black folks remember it as gun shoot at Bay Point, right? That's how the Gullah Geechee remember it, is gun shoot, yeah, at Bay Point. So, you know, the Combee is 40 miles away. And I know the white people on the Combee heard those big guns. How do I know? Mary Boynton Chestnut wrote about it in her diary. She ran. She got in her horse and she ran to her cousin's house. Her cousin was married to one of the Combee planters. And she's, oh my God, you know, she thought her cousin's husband was on the front line. He wasn't. But she thought that they should be a little bit more excited. They weren't. They were not excited. But she knew what was coming. She knew they were next, okay? I know that the Combee planters felt the presence of the Union Army and Navy after the Battle of Port Royal, because they came together as aides de camp and they gave their resources, including their enslaved labor force, but timber, etc., to obstruct the Combee River after the Battle of Port Royal. So they were concerned that they were next, but they were also, they were a little arrogant, they were a little greedy, and they decided they weren't leaving. Because, you know, the rice was too profitable and it was too plentiful. And if they could just stop the Union from coming up that river, they could get another crop or two. And so they dug in. They weren't leaving. Other people fled, okay? Even other planters on the upper Combee River fled. But the ones on the lower Combee, they were like, no, we're not going anywhere. We're gonna get this rice, okay? We're gonna keep planting rice as long as we can. And they're gonna have to come and get us because we're not leaving. Okay, so I also know they weren't the only ones who heard the guns. They weren't the only ones who smelled the smoke. They weren't the only ones who felt the vibrations of those warships coming up Port Royal Sound 40 miles away. The enslaved people heard it too. And they knew that wasn't the Confederate Navy. The Confederacy didn't have any boats like that. I'm sorry, ships. The U.S. Navy had ships. The U.S. Army had boats. The Confederacy really had neither. So they knew what that was. It was freedom. And they were determined from that point to get to the U.S. Army or Navy any way they could. Any way they could. And so there's stories. I tell a story in the book about a man who plated a basket boat and smeared it with tar and took a shutter off the slaveholder's house and paddled himself out until he got picked up by the U.S. Navy. Okay? Freedom. He wasn't the only one. He's the one whose story we know. Okay? I'm able to track in Combee that there were men from the Combee, from the lower Combee River, from the 7 rice plantations that were raided who got away and they went to Beaufort and they're working for the U.S. Army quartermaster. Before the raid, there's plenty other ones, but those are the ones from the plantations I was studying. Freedom. Anything they could do to get to freedom, they did after November 1861. This is the beginning of the Combee River Raid. As we know, it's also the beginning of the Port Royal Experiment, which was the largest social movement to date. And so you had 8,000 to 10,000 people who are no longer in bondage. They're not legally free until July of 1862, but they are legally contraband, right, of war. They would not be returned to bondage. They're destitute. They're illiterate. They have, if they're lucky, the clothes on their backs, right? And there's a cotton crop in the fields that's ready to be harvested. So this is when the northern volunteers come down, the teachers, the missionaries, the labor managers who are going to work on these Sea Island cotton plantations. They're going to open stores, open schools, etc. It is during this time that Harriet Tubman comes down. She's not a teacher. She's not a missionary. She's sent by the governor of Massachusetts, John Andrew, to serve as a spy for the U.S. Army. Now, we can only conjecture why Governor Andrew thought she would be a good spy. Maybe it's because of all the espionage she gathered on the Underground Railroad, right? Maybe it's because of the 13 trips she made back into what I like to call the prison house of bondage to bring out family, friends, community members, risking her freedom 13 times to rescue at least 70 people, and risking her freedom to give other people detailed instructions on how they can get to freedom, at least 70 more people, okay? Undercover, living off of the land through a network of safe houses. This is probably why he thought she could be of some use in South Carolina. Tubman also works as a nurse and a cook and an entrepreneur and a laundress. She ran her own cook shop. She made gingerbread and root beer. And hired other freedom seekers to sell them for her. She wore many hats, and many of the women who were involved in the Port Royal Experiment did wear many hats. And some of these hats that Tubman wore, like cooking for General Quincy A. Gilmore or serving as a laundress in his camp, I think these were subterfuges, right? I think this was a subterfuge. I think this was part of her spy. This is part of her espionage. She was that close to the power that she could bring the information from the freedom seekers right to the commanders of the Department of the South. So we also know that the first South Carolina volunteers enlist after the Emancipation Proclamation goes into effect. And this is another stage in the Port Royal Experiment, one could argue. And this is the first Black regiment that is authorized to be organized in South Carolina. It's the second South Carolina volunteers that conducted the raid. Now, one of the challenges that I faced in writing the book was that Tubman's Civil War service is not mentioned in the military record. It's not. And as a historian, you know, I don't find that terribly surprising. She's a black woman. It's the Civil War. Now, it's evident, and it's very clear, and it's very well documented that the U.S. Army and the U.S. Navy relied on intelligence that was gathered by black spies, scouts. They relied on black pilots who knew the rivers. That is very well documented. These folks are rarely named. They're very rarely named. Of those who are named, and often they'll say a man, you know, a slave. It's a man. It's a man. I have not seen, and I cannot say it does not exist, but seen in the military record, the notation of an enslaved woman as being the person who has gathered and given the intelligence. But just because it's not there doesn't mean it didn't happen. It just means they didn't write it down, right? So I love a challenge. And this was probably challenge number 2, but this was right up there with how do you tell a new story about Harriet Tubman? What is there new to say about Tubman's life when it has been so thoroughly researched, right? If anything, this is the one chapter of which we didn't have a detailed account of her life. But the thought is always, well, maybe we don't have it because the sources just are not there. Maybe there's a reason we don't have it, right? Well, how I overcame this is, I like to call it, I think the technical term is the kitchen sink approach. I use it a lot in all areas of my life. I attack it with every tool I have, everything, including the kitchen sink, right? So if it's not in the military record, where is it? And where I found it really is in the letters of the abolitionists who came down during the Port Royal experiment. Tubman was firmly ensconced in abolitionist networks, Massachusetts, Philadelphia, New York, 3 examples, okay? Some of those very same people who were her supporters, who were her friends, they or their children, sometimes both, came to Port Royal in Beaufort. The same people. Those folks or their children wrote letters home. And they talked about, I saw Harriet Tubman. So one example, and I think this was my favorite because it's in a private collection. The collection is in Montana, of all places, and literally had never been seen before. And it sheds so much light on what we think we know about the Port Royal experiment. It's a letter by a young man by the name of James Seymour Severance. He was 22. He was a Harvard student, undergrad. Mother was both parents, but it was really his mother who was more active and more vocal and more well-positioned than his father even, was an abolitionist, first in Cleveland, and then they moved to Massachusetts. His father gets a commission as a tax commissioner, and then young Seymour, as he's called, gets a position to come down to Port Royal. Don't really know what he's gonna do, right? And there are these wonderful stories of the fact that he didn't actually tell people when he got here who he was, so he was forced to do things like herd some donkeys and clean out the pen and that kind of thing, and his mother's not happy. She tells him to take his letters out of his pocket, and give it to Edward Pierce so Edward Pierce knows that he actually needs to do some work. He's here to do some work. But Seymour writes it in his diary about this extraordinary conversation he has with Edward Pierce. It's on May 1st of 1862. And it sounds as if Pierce is really, he's venting, he's having a conversation with himself. Seymour just happens to be there. And Edward Pierce, in case you don't know, was the architect of the Port Royal experiment, right? He's the one who really set this thing up and brings the first group of volunteers and stays and runs it for the beginning of the experiment, right? And he is upset because he's just gotten a letter from Frank Sanborn, who was one of Tubman's first biographers, that they're sending Harriet Tubman to Beaufort or to the Sea Islands. He is outraged. Why? He asked for a capable man. Can she teach? No. First of all, she's not a man. Second of all, can she teach? No. And he means teach, A, B, C, D, 1, 2, 3. No. What are they thinking sending her here? Basically, I don't have any use for her. And Seymour, because he was raised correctly, his mother and father taught him well. He said, well, look at what she did in Maryland. Maybe she can teach the freedom seekers what freedom is all about. He's a young man. He's speaking up. Oh, no, 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 no. And this is at a time when the federal government, in managing the Sea Island cotton plantations and harvesting and planting and whatever, the Sea Island cotton crop, was not paying the freedom seekers consistently. And was often, people were working and being coerced to work without being paid. This is a free labor experiment, right? Slavery is over. But the federal government is not paying black people who are working for it. And there were some superintendents. There was discussion about whether or not the old systems of punishment had to be used again. Well, we know what that is. They're talking about the lash. So what he's saying is that she can't come here, not with all of this going on, because she's not going to agree to it. And we can't have her stirring up the freedom seekers. And everybody who signs on has to accept President Lincoln's gradual approach. Okay? We have to take this thing slowly. And we may have to use these old systems of punishment for a while. She's not going to go along with the program. Well, Tubman, of course, did not end up going to the Sea Islands. She was not in the rural areas. She did not work, let me put it that way. She did not work in the Sea Islands. She was not on the plantations that Edward Pierce was so concerned about, okay? She's in downtown Beaufort. She was on the front lines. Downtown Beaufort was the front lines of freedom, okay? This is where the freedom seekers came when they left Confederate occupied territory. This is where they came. And this is where it was almost like a clearinghouse. Their needs were assessed. And depending on if they were able-bodied and able to work, if they came from a sea island, right? If they were not able-bodied and they needed rations, this all happened in downtown Beaufort. This is where the refugee camps were, and that's where Tubman worked. So there is another letter by George Garrison, who was William Lloyd Garrison's son, right? A very close Tubman supporter. And he writes about Tubman's work in those refugee camps and says that she was debriefing people in the refugee camps as they came into U.S. occupied territory. These are people who are coming from the Confederacy. They have seen what's going on over there, the movement of troops, the movement of arms, the strength, troop strengths, right? Torpedoes, I'm coming back to that. They've seen Confederate military movements, strengths. So they're bringing this to the Union. And Tubman is there when they arrive. He said she made it her business to talk to all of these people. This is George Garrison's letter home. And she gathered more intelligence than anybody. Okay? Okay, we know that Tubman led a group of men. She was a leader of men, 8 or 9. These men were all spies, scouts, and pilots. And we know this, one of the ways we know this is from her pension file. Now, most people don't know that Harriet Tubman remarried. So she went back for John Tubman. He had remarried. And that's all I'll say about that. He had remarried, and she devoted herself to helping her people. She didn't let any grass grow under her feet, okay? Because after the war, she married herself a young man who was a civil, when I say young, he was young.
Oh, yeah.
At least a decade younger than her, at least. He was young. He dies of tuberculosis. And he was a Civil War veteran. So once he passes, she then is eligible to apply for his pension. So we know because she files, she signs, she doesn't sign, there's an affidavit, she testifies that she was the leader of men 8 to 9, okay? And we knew the names of these men. In Combee, we learned more about these men than we've ever known. So Walter Plowden, we know, was born free, and he liberated himself and worked for the 47th New York Regiment, and then enlisted in the 13th USCT Regiment. And he works continuously as a spy, okay? And we know that he went on a reconnaissance mission up the Combee before the raid in the spring of 1863. And the US Army attests to this, okay? This is in his pension file. We also know that Plowden and Tubman were in business together. I mentioned that she made gingerbread and root beer, and she hired other other freedom seekers to sell for her in the downtown area, that she and Walter Plowden were buying ingredients like sugar, okay? And that they testified against John Marshall, who was a white private, because the accusation was that, did I say Marshall? I meant John Webster. The accusation was that Webster was taking rations from the freedom seekers and selling them on the side, right? And I should mention, we also know that Tubman shopped for a while at the commissary. She had privileges to buy from the military commissary where the military officers bought their foodstuffs. She gave this up, and this is why she's an entrepreneur, right? She's supporting herself. She's not being supported by the U.S. Army. But it's possibly when she was shopping at the commissary that she comes, I believe, to Hilton Head and attended a funeral at night on a plantation, which was likely in U.S. occupied territory, where she was a part of a ring shout. Okay, I digressed. I got excited. So we also learn about Mott Blake. Mott Blake was a deer hunter, and he actually liberated himself in a raid in June of 1862. The U.S. Army was going around raiding folk. They called them the notorious rebels. They would drive up to somebody's house, some Confederate commander, and they were like, oh, I think so-and-so lives over there. Let's go check it out. They drove up to Arthur Blake's house on the South Santee. This was part of a South Santee campaign, but they went to his house because he was in England, but he was allowing the Confederate Army to use it. They raided it. A number, I think it was 400, over 400 enslaved people in that South Santee area were freed. Mott Blake was one of them. He was not in bondage on Arthur Blake's plantation. The slaveholder's name was Shoolbred, who held him in bondage, but he's in that area. He sees the opportunity to liberate himself. He becomes one of Tubman's spy scouts and pilots, and he actually enlisted in the 21st Regiment, Company I. Arthur Blake, by the way, had a cousin on the Combee whose name was Walter Blake, and Walter Blake's Bonnie Hall plantation is one of the 7 that is destroyed in the raid. And then we learn about Isaac Hayward. I'm coming back to Isaac Hayward because the story is too juicy. I'm going to keep you in suspense. But he was a boatman who was born enslaved on Coosaw Island, okay? And Peter Burns, who was too old to enlist, but he worked as a scout for General Saxton and General Hunter, and he brought 132 freedom seekers to freedom weeks before the Combee River raid. And even though he's too old to enlist, his son, Jack Burns, enlisted in the 1st South Carolina Volunteers, Company F. Now, as I was in the final stages of writing Combee, when I say final stages, there were so many stages, but Combee came out at the end of February. This is the end of November, okay? And my editor is every day calling for the book, and I'm like, I'm not done yet, and I'll get it to you when I'm done. And I had these documents that I needed to fully incorporate into the manuscript. Dr. Stephen Weiss and Dr. Larry Rowland were 2 very important advisors to my project, as was Dr. Kate Larson, who is one of Harriet Tubman's biographers. Dr. Rowland, Dr. Weiss, Larry, and Stephen, 3-volume, is it 3 or 4? Very thick volumes on the history of Beaufort County, and Stephen Weiss being the Low Country Civil War expert. We had a healthy debate because he was skeptical about Harriet Tubman and her role in the Civil War, and that was fine. Okay, because remember, my research challenge, one of them, was that Tubman is not mentioned in the military record. And Civil War historians can be very about the military record. I get it. So I leaned into his skepticism because I wanted the book to pass muster with the Civil War historians. So back to November of last year, one of the last documents that I was trying to shoehorn into the page proofs, which is not a good idea, but that's what they told me to do, was U.S. Army Provost Marshal's report. There was a man by the name of Francis Izard who escaped from Newport Plantation in Beaufort a week before the raid. Now, Stephen Weiss was also skeptical, and it wasn't just Stephen, there's a couple of Civil War historians, skeptical about whether or not there were torpedoes on the Combee River. Even though Colonel James Montgomery, in his one paragraph, and it is only one paragraph, report on the Combee River raid, which is not published in the military record. So there's a whole lot that's not in the military record. He says that that was one of their goals, was to defuse the torpedoes. But no, we don't think there were torpedoes. Well, I was transcribing this document, this Provost Marshal's report. Francis Izard escaped from Newport a week before the raid. He came in and he told them where what the torpedoes looked like. Okay? He said, there are torpedoes. Here's where the Confederate troops are. Those boys are hungry. And if you come up here with some food, they might follow you. He told where I'm from. He's on a Middleton plantation. I'm at Newport. The whole thing, okay? So I'm transcribing this document and trying to get these quotations into my draft. And whenever I transcribe, you know, it's cursive. And cursive can be hard to read. And that whatever phrase you're going to try to quote, that's the one that you're not going to be able to read. So I said, okay, I'm going to send it to Stephen. And I wanted to know, not only do you agree with the transcription, but does this even sound plausible? In your experience, have you heard of whatever he's talking about, that kind of torpedo used by the Confederacy in this region during the Civil War? He sent me a picture of a potbelly stove. The torpedo was shaped like a potbelly stove. And he had been skeptical, but his note said, we did it, right? We found it. So there were torpedoes on the Combee River, and we know Harriet Tubman's nephew, Harkless Bowley, wrote in a letter to another of her biographers, Earl Conrad. These letters were written in the 1930s, that Tubman's men, the 8 or 9 men who were her spies, scouts, and pilots, whom she led, had found the men who were forced by the Confederacy to mine the Combee River with torpedoes. That's espionage right there. That's gathering and of intelligence. They took those men back to the site. They oversaw the removal of these torpedoes, which opened the river, the Combee River, to the U.S. Army. Okay? So a week before the raid, the torpedoes are there. In that stretch of time, this must have happened. And I don't know where Harkless Bowley, where else would he hear it other than from Tubman, right? She must have told him. And this was family oral history that he kept and that he shared with her biographer. Okay. The last piece is there was skepticism about, well, if Tubman was there, She stayed on the boat. She stayed on the John Adams. She didn't get off the boat. She didn't go on the plantations. Harkless Bowley also writes that she personally went and brought the freedom seekers off. And there's a letter from another teacher who was down from Massachusetts during the Port Royal experiment. And lots of people wrote a few days after the raid. They wrote all kinds of letters home about Colonel Montgomery's, the gallant Colonel Montgomery's expedition, because there was very little else going on in the Department of the South at the time. So this was the thing to talk about, right? She wrote home that it was a woman by the name of Harriet Tubbs. She didn't know Tubman, Harriet Tubbs, who went on the plantations and brought the freedom seekers off. Okay, so research challenge number 2 was that I wanted to tell an authentic story. I wanted to tell a story that really put people on the plantations, that really put people in the shoes of the freedom seekers. I'm someone who has spent my career studying rice in West Africa as well as in the South Carolina and Georgia Lowcountry, so I know the rice fields pretty well. I did not know the river, and what I wanted to do was to map the story of the river, the story of the raid. I wanted to map the primary sources, newspaper articles, life histories, pension files, military record, all of this. I wanted to map it onto the land. So that required a bit of field work, right? That required a bit of field work. One of the ways I did this, we reenacted the raid 3 times, different aspects of the raid, going up and down the river. The second time, we left under the full moon. The raid took place under the full moon, June 1st of 1863. And when I say full moon, we're in the low country, so you should also be thinking flood tide, right? But this was also the spring tide. So that is very important to know, because the Combee is a wide river, but the Combee is also full of sandbars. And so getting up the river in these large vessels would have been impossible if it were not for the spring tide. And they left 9 p.m. We left around 9 p.m. This time we left from Fields Point. The raid actually left from downtown Beaufort, from the wharf in downtown Beaufort. And they went up through the Beaufort River, the Coosaw River, and then up the mouth of the Combee. Now, when I reenacted it with friends, and I am the principal investigator for a group of scientists, and I drew on them quite a bit. So as we went up the river, no gadgets, no lights, and my research had shown that the boats would have traveled around 6 to 7 miles per hour. So that's what we did. What I learned from that is just an inkling of how the pilots would have navigated the river, particularly under the full moon. It was dark, but the light of the moon shimmered off of the river. And then the marsh on one side and the rice field on the other were just dark blobs, right? They were dark blobs. Okay, so it gave me an inkling. Now, the second time we went up the river, actually it was the third, long story. This time we left from downtown Beaufort during the day, all the gadgets, fast, motor, bang, Depth meters, we ran aground twice. We ran aground twice. And we went up through the Coosaw River, and 3 boats left June 1st, 9 p.m. from downtown Beaufort. One of them ran aground in the mouth of the Coosaw, right about where we ran aground. Lots of sandbars and floating sandbars, okay? Now, I think that they took this route. It was risky, but it was a shortcut. It saved a tremendous amount of time, but it was risky because the Coosaw is notorious for sandbars and for floating sandbars. Isaac Hayward was born on Coosaw Island. He was one of Harriet Tubman's spies, scouts, and pilots. He's a boatman. I suspect that Isaac Hayward was influential in making that decision. And even though they had to take this risk, right? Even though they took the risk and they lost a boat, they could have lost all 3 boats. They didn't know that the Confederacy wasn't there. They didn't know that, right? So the risk to go up more quickly in sort of a straighter line to get to the mouth of the Combee versus going around saved a tremendous amount of time. And number one, they're working under the cover of darkness. So to arrive at the mouth of the Combee before daybreak. Okay, now Isaac Hayward, I promised you some Combee drama. One of the things it's another one of my favorite documents in the book. He did not enlist. He did not enlist in the U.S. Army. There's another Isaac Hayward. It's not the same man. I'm here to tell you it's not the same person. This Isaac Hayward actually worked on the Planter after the war. And I think that Robert Small's Planter incident played an important role in Tubman's recruitment of spy scouts and pilots, okay? I don't have evidence that Hayward worked for the Planter before the raid. He certainly was not a part of the crew that took the Planter successfully from the Confederacy, but he works on the Planter after the raid. But in his Freedman's Bank account, where he lists his family, right, his mother, his siblings, his wife, his children, he lists his father as Captain W.C. Hayward. The description in, I don't know what you call these slashes, is dead and white. Well, Captain, he wasn't a captain. W.C. Hayward is William C. Hayward, who was one of the commanders during the Battle of Port Royal of one of the forts. He was also one of the planters on the Combee, one of 7, whose plantation was destroyed. And I think for several reasons, he was actually the target of the raid. He was a notorious rebel, as the U.S. Army liked to call them, and I think they went up the river to take him out. So here's Isaac Hayward, one of Tubman's spies, scouts, and pilots, who possibly made the call for them to go up the Coosaw River, and he says that's his daddy. My editor and I had many conversations, and I think in some ways we are codependent, and he just allowed me to do what I wanted to do. And I convinced him that there were documents that we had to print, because even if I cited them, people would not believe them. This is one of them. I said, nobody is going to believe that one of Tubman's spies, scouts, and pilots was the illegitimate son of one of the Combee planters. If you don't put it in the book, they're not going to believe it, so it's there. Okay, my last research challenge was, and this was really the primary challenge. This for me was the core of the book because I'm not a Tubman biographer, right? It was not going to be a biography of Harriet Tubman. That's been done and done very, very well. I wanted to tell the story of the Freedom Seekers. I wanted to tell the story of the people who were liberated in the raid. I didn't know how I was going to do it. It sounded crazy at the time. But there were a couple of things that led me to believe I could actually do it. One of the first pieces of evidence was an affidavit by William C. Hayward, our friend. After the war, I think it was 3 of the Combee planters who were raided applied to the Confederacy for compensation for their losses. There was a program, and they applied. And in this affidavit, the first one I found, and when I found it, I didn't know that there were others, was by William C. Hayward, and he lists the names of the people he lost. First names. He lists ages, occupations for those who had a trade. He lists the names of the children with their mothers. I thought, oh, wow. I want to know who these people are. Okay, that's number one. I filed it away for years. I filed it away. Even before I knew I was writing this book, I filed it away. The next thing is, I mentioned that I had some family business to take care of, and we're still taking care of it. I had a cemetery in Colleton County that our family patriarch gave me the responsibility for. And in looking for the Fields family, and in looking for our earliest known ancestor, Hector Fields, I went looking for Hector's pension file because the research showed that he was a soldier in the 2nd South Carolina Volunteers, which we did not know. We didn't know anything about Hector. And I was actually working, I always have to give credit where credit is due. I was working with the International African American Museum. And I turned to my friend Tony Carrier. I was in a state about this cemetery, okay? Don't get me started on the cemetery. We had some very serious family business to take care of, and it became my responsibility before our patriarch had died. I did not know what to do. I turned to Tony, and she's like, what do you have? Give me what you have. I gave her the information my cousin gave me. She looked at it. She's like, oh, that's Hector Fields. He's in the 2nd South Carolina. He's from Beaufort. I was like, Beaufort? We're not from Beaufort. So that started this whole journey of looking for Hector, okay? So the first thing that Tony helped me to do, she found his brother, Jonas. Family patriarch's name was Jonas. Now Hector, my 3rd great uncle's name is Jonas. Jonas had a pension file. Their sister didn't know he had a sister. Phoebe testifies she has these 2 brothers, Hector and Jonas. She testifies they were enslaved by the Verdier family, downtown Beaufort. Jonas was a house slave. Their parents, these are my great-great-great-great-grandparents, Anson and Judy, were house slaves. Hector must have been a field hand on a plantation. Phoebe, another Verdier plantation, I think on Ladies Island. Phoebe was given away as a wedding gift to the Verdier's daughter, okay? I did not know, the only thing I knew was Hector, father to son, down to my grandfather. That's all we knew from the 1870 census, okay? So this one pension file opened up our family. And there were other people who testified in Jonas Field's pension file, enslaved by the same family, in the same house as Jonas, Anson, and Judy. So now I have this community, okay? So it got me thinking, could I do this on the Combee? Okay? That's number 2. I'm still not thinking about Combee as a book. I'm doing other things. I'm minding my business. I'm trying to figure out the cemetery. Tony and I also cooked up a little scheme. As I was looking for Hector's pension file, I went to Washington, D.C. I went to the National Archives. These were the days when you had to go to the National Archives, and you got maybe 7 pulls in a day. Nothing was digitized. This is 2016. It's not 50 years ago. It's recent, right? That digitization has opened everything up. So I go looking for Hector's pension file. We also came up with a list of names because my paternal grandmother's family is from Green Pond, and all of these names were the same names that I saw, last names that I saw on the roster of the 2nd South Carolina Volunteers. So we came up with the list. She said, go get these pension files. I got them. I filed them. I was teaching. I forgot about them. Months later, I opened my file and I started reading them. The first file, we grew up together. We were enslaved together. The veteran is testifying. We were together until we got on the gunboat. I was like, gunboat? Does that say gunboat? So the third piece was that the Combee freedom seekers testified about the raid in their pension files. That's when I knew that there was something here that had not been, we hadn't seen before, and that I think I can tell this story through their own words. I think I can put the reader in those rice fields with the people when the gunboats came. These people who grew up together, right? Men and women who grew up together. I think I can reconstruct that enslaved community before, during, and after the raid. So I was emboldened then. I didn't know how I would do it. So I'm going to end today by reading you a few excerpts from the book, because I think that the first one is going to just kind of elucidate this research challenge. The second one, I think, is going to bring us back to our occasion today and tomorrow and Sunday. And I want to end on that occasion. So another piece of evidence that I had found and just filed away as I was working on another project was the life story of a man by the name of Minus Hamilton. And Minus Hamilton was probably one of the oldest freedom seekers to liberate himself in the raid. Okay? And he told his life story to Colonel Thomas Wentworth Higginson, who was the commander of the 1st South Carolina Volunteers. And Higginson wrote about it in his war journal, and he wrote about it in his memoir, and he's preserved this story for us, which he attempted to record in the Gullah language. Okay? So I'm going to read you 2 excerpts in which I talk about Minus Hamilton, and then I'm going to switch to the final excerpt. Okay. Yes. I love it. I love it. I love it. Page 317. Chapter 14, Day Clean. At 88, Minus Hamilton was likely the oldest of the bondspeople on record as having escaped the prison house of bondage in the raid. I will let Mr. Hamilton tell his story. The people was a hoeing massa. They was a hoeing in the rice field when the gunboats come. Then every man drapped them hoe and left the rice. The massa he stand and call, run to the wood for hide. Yankee come, sell you to Cuba, run for hide. Every man he run, and my God, run all the other way. Massa stand in the wood, peep, peep, fade for truss. He say, run to the wood, and every man run by him straight to the boat. An hour or two before day clean, as dawn is called, Hamilton was among the enslaved people laboring in the tidal rice fields on James L. Paul's Combee rice plantation, where, as we've seen, he and his family were sold in December 1859. Paul's place was the first rice plantation that Montgomery and his men encountered on the east side as they steamed up the river into Colleton. Minus Hamilton could have been one of the woolly heads at work in the rice fields that Captain Apthorpe observed. Every person forced to labor in the rice fields dropped their long-handled hoe with the angled blade and left the rice in the fields. The overseer, whom Hamilton called Massa, the formerly enslaved man appears to have called every white man Massa, including Colonel Higginson, did much what Joshua Nichols, who's a planter, did. He stood in the field and called to the enslaved field hands working there to run and hide in the woods. The Yankees had finally come and would sell them to Cuba. Hamilton and his fellow bondspeople were not fooled. They did not feign attachment to the enslaver nor obedience to the overseer, despite Joshua Nichols' later insistence. They also did the opposite of what they were ordered to do. The overseer, like Joshua Nichols, ran into the woods. From his wooded hiding place, he looked back at the enslaved people, then looked again. He told the enslaved people one last time to run and hide in the woods. They ignored him utterly. They ran for their lives and freedom straight to the boat. I am skipping over now to page 320. And I should say that Joshua Nichols is he's not a planter. He married a woman who owned a plantation on the Combee. She died. He didn't own the plantation, but he had a life interest in the plantation at the time of the raid. And he was actually on the plantation when the raid happened. And he wrote a letter about it to a friend, which was published in the newspaper. So Minus Hamilton's chapter, which is chapter 14, abuts Joshua Nichols' chapter, which is chapter 13, in which I talk about what Nichols experienced in the raid according to his letter. Of course, Mr. Hamilton couldn't write, right? He was illiterate, but he gets the last word. Okay, page 320. Hamilton likely never thought he would see such a day, and it was in his life, and it was a long life. He had been sold with his wife Hagar and their daughter Bina in 1853 from Edward Rutledge Lowndes' estate to John Parker. On Parker's place, Bina married Harry Mack. Both of them were prime hands, and gave birth to Minus's granddaughter, also named Hagar. John Parker's heir, Arthur Middleton Parker, went bankrupt and ultimately sold his plantation and the people he held in bondage to James L. Paul in December 1859. Little Hagar was 4 or 5 when the Lincoln's gunboats came up the Combee. Here's Mr. Hamilton again. "De black soldiers so presumptuous come right ashore, hold their head up, First thing I know, there was a barn, 10,000 bushel, rough rice, all in a blaze. Then Massa's great house, all crackling up the roof. Didn't care for seeing blaze. Lord, Massa didn't care nothing at all. I was going to the boat. Hamilton likely considered himself blessed to have lived long enough to see black soldiers so presumptuous, as he called them. And you can hear that LR consonant alternation, which is very common in Gullah, especially at this time for people who were African born. An enslaved person could not look a white person in the eye without inviting insult or worse, injury. In contrast, the black soldiers who came right ashore wearing the Union blue coats and pantaloons and carrying loaded muskets stood with their backs straight and held their heads up. Hamilton told Higginson what he saw after the 2nd South Carolina Volunteers left Lincoln's gunboats. They went to the slaveholder's barn where he stored the rice his enslaved labor force had grown and harvested the previous year, 10,000 bushels of rough rice, and set it all on fire. The presumptuous black soldiers did not stop there. The next thing Minus Hamilton saw was the country estate of the man who held him and his family in bondage, engulfed in flames up to the roof. Hamilton's gesticulations became even more animated, Higginson recalled. Higginson may have asked Hamilton how he felt watching the property of the man who legally owned him and his family go up in flames. Hamilton responded he didn't care at all, but he made it clear to Higginson that what he did care about was seizing the opportunity to liberate himself and his family. I was going to the boat. Now, what I wanted to do most, as I said, was to tell the story of the raid through the voices and the words of the freedom seekers. And I had a lot of wants. I wanted to identify who escaped in the raid, and I wanted to identify their family members. And I was able to do that with the help of IAAM, Center for Family History. And what we did, the pension files were sort of the base layer, on top of which we layered all of the documents we could find about these freedom seekers' lives. Now, remembering that Colleton County and Beaufort County are burned counties, right? Their records before the Civil War were burned. They do not exist. These plantations are in burned counties. However, most of these planters had houses in Charleston. About 80% of these documents were actually filed in Charleston. And we looked, and it's public record now, bills of sale, mortgages, marriage settlements, wills, estate records. I'm missing one, but that's good enough. Because this is the only way to document the lives of these freedom seekers, okay? So when I say that he was sold in 1853 from Edward Lutridge, boom. If you look at the citation, the document is there, right? And layering on top of that, Freedmen's bank account records, the census in which enslaved, the pension files, of course, in this massive database I created, in which enslaved people testified about the names of their family members, and then looking for those family groupings in the antebellum records. So I'm able to identify hundreds of people who escaped in the raid and tell the story of the raid through their voices. I wrote a piece for the New York Times about the research for this book. because what I came to understand, and it took a lot of people to sort of pull this out of me, is that this research can help African Americans who are the descendants of slaves to find their enslaved family members. And, you know, genealogists have dealt with the 1870 brick wall, and I dealt with the 1870 brick wall trying to find Hector, because that was the earliest we knew. It's the first time that most formerly enslaved people are actually documented in a federal source with last names, okay? If you go to the planter sources, and historians typically deal with the plantation records, which deny our humanity and list enslaved people by first name only. How do you bridge that gap between the 1870 census going backward to the plantations on which these people were enslaved, and then the census going forward to descendants? It's with the pension files. So if you want to learn more, go to the New York Times opinion section. Thank God there were 29 days in February this year. It's published February 29th. But I, you know, in looking for my own family members, I hope that it will help other people, okay? My last excerpt, because the Combee freedom seekers, yeah, okay. The Combee freedom seekers, once they got on the boat and sailed back to downtown Beaufort, they arrived the morning of June 3rd at the wharf in downtown. They parade down the street. And we have to remember that Beaufort was the epicenter of freedom. And I talk in the book about the overlapping waves of refugees who are coming through here, okay? People from the Sea Islands, people from the upcountry, people from Georgia, people from Florida, who are trying to get to freedom. And that some of these folks had been free since the Battle of Port Royal. And they had established communities here. They were working. They were in school. They or their children were in school, right? It was a very different experience than they had as enslaved people. With all the fits and starts, it was very different, especially by June of 1863. But the U.S. Army, people were constantly coming in, right? People are coming in here from Confederate territory, but in smaller numbers. This was 756 people who were straight out of the rice fields. They were straight off the plantation. 750 people. I mean, people came out. They were like, ooh, what? It's like, come on, y'all, come and see. People stood out on Bay Street to see the Combee freedom seekers because they were free. Okay. I'm going to read these last two excerpts. Several days after the Combee River raid, the New South newspaper reported that a tremendous reception of well-wishers had awaited the strange spectacle that would take place when the expedition arrived in Beaufort. They were not disappointed, as several hundred genuine contrabands paraded down Bay Street, early on the morning of June 3rd. They wore the clothes in which they had escaped bondage. The men, pantaloons and shirts like Minus Hamilton, and the women, single frocks and handkerchiefs covering their heads like Hager Hamilton. Many were in their field suits of dirty gray, which they had donned to report to the title rights fields before day clean. In spite of all they had been through, their faces beamed, according to the New South, with that intelligence which is inseparable from formerly enslaved people fresh off the plantation, enjoying their newfound and hard-won freedom, notwithstanding the filth and tatters of slavery. The Combee freedom seekers did not have much, but finally they had their freedom. Beaufort was, of course, the command center of the federal government's Port Royal experiment and the clearinghouse for freedom seekers who had been able to make their way on foot or by water to Union lines since the Battle of Port Royal in November 1861. Yet 6 months after the Emancipation Proclamation went into effect, enslavers still held people a few miles west of Beaufort, up the rivers and tidal creeks. The morning of June 3rd, 1863, however, and this is a quote, "All the darkies in town were in the streets," unquote, the New South reported, gazing with unaffected surprise and admiration at the freedom seekers whom Colonel Montgomery, Harriet Tubman, the 2nd South Carolina Volunteers, the 3rd Rhode Island Heavy Artillery, and Tubman's ring of spies, scouts, and pilots had released from the prison house of bondage. For those in the back, I am switching now to page 390. Okay, this is my final excerpt. And at the end of this, I'm gonna need y'all's help. You're gonna see in a minute why I need your help. I'm not a good songstress. In his June 20th, 1863 piece in the Wisconsin State Journal, Jonathan Yarrington wrote he had never felt such a swelling of emotions of gratitude to God as he did at that moment. Colonel Montgomery, the gallant deliverer, addressed the crowds in strains of thrilling eloquence. The Combee freedom seekers and other freedom seekers at the church intoned a song so heartfelt and cordial. And the song was, "There is a white robe for thee." It may have reminded those in the audience of freedom seekers' spontaneous rendition of "My Country 'Tis of Thee" at General Saxton's Emancipation Proclamation celebration 6 months earlier, on January 1st, 1863. As unbridled tears fell, there was not a dry eye in the house. According to Yarrington, a speech by, quote, "the black woman," unquote, followed Colonel Montgomery's address. The speaker was not just any black woman, though there were certainly hundreds in the room. Women who had liberated themselves from bondage in the raid, women who had liberated themselves from bondage in Beaufort and the surrounding Sea Islands as early as the Battle of Port Royal. Since the other 2 black women who took part in the Port Royal experiment, Charlotte Fortin and Susie King Taylor, were not on the scene, it could only have been one black woman who addressed the crowd at the church in downtown Beaufort the day after the raid, Harriet Tubman. And I quote, "the woman who led the raid and under whose inspiration it was originated and conducted," unquote. Tubman gave the Combee refugees a lecture of full soundness and real native eloquence, which would do honor to any man. according to Yarrington. Without a transcript, we are left to wonder which words Tubman chose to deliver to the crowd. She certainly told her story of growing up in and escaping bondage. She probably spoke of liberating freedom seekers in rescue missions for over a decade in giving instructions to others. She likely spoke to the throngs of freedom speakers in the church in Beaufort that day about the responsibilities of freedom. Nor is there a record of whether she raised her melodious voice in song, as she often did when speaking about her experiences as a bondsperson, self-liberator and conductor on the Underground Railroad. If she sang to the assembled crowd, all of whom would surely have preferred death to a return to bondage, she might have chosen, "Oh, freedom, oh, freedom, oh, freedom over me." And before I be a slave, I'll be buried in my grave and go home to my Lord and be free. That church was Tabernacle. This is where Harriet Tubman gave So we celebrate the unveiling of the Harriet Tubman Monument tomorrow. And I see somebody over there in the corner who is hiding. Harriet Tubman's niece, Ernestine Tina Wyatt. We give honor to her for preserving her family, her aunt's legacy, all of these years. So on June 1st and 2nd, 1863, they took 756 freedom seekers out of the rice fields, and this was the largest slave rebellion in U.S. history. They took the hose out of the people's hands, and they put a musket in it. 150 men, ages 14 to 60, and there was one man who was 70, enlisted the following morning in the 2nd South Carolina Volunteers. During the Civil War, about 186,000 fought for freedom of others. 135,000 of them were formerly enslaved. There were countless black spies, scouts, pilots who risked their freedom, their very lives, so that other black people still in bondage could be free. Our story is a story of freedom. Our ancestors were freedom fighters. And 500,000 formerly enslaved people liberated themselves during the Civil War. It was our ancestors' liberatory acts, of which the Combee River Raid is a very important one. Not President Lincoln, not Congress, not even the Emancipation Proclamation, that made the destruction of slavery inevitable. Thank you. Do we have time for questions, Reverend Hodges? Yes, yes, yes. Yes.
So you never finished telling us what happened with you in that graveyard.
So, where do I start?
I gave you too much for the night.
My cousin had a couple years before, he was like, here, Miss Historian, you're the historian here,
Right.
take this.
That's how they do.
This was back in the day. He had gone to the courthouse, he'd gone to the census, and he had Hector, father to son, down to my grandfather from the census. He gave it to me. He's like, this is yours. You finish it.
Right.
I was like, okay. I filed it. That's what I tend to do. I file things until you have time to think about it. And I was here doing some lecturing, and I had a weekend in between lectures. This is how naive I was. And I thought, I'll work on the family history in this weekend.
Yeah, okay.
So I went to the cemetery where my grandparents are buried. That's the cemetery we always came back to bury family members. That's the one I know. I've been up and down that cemetery, but I went again. I'm photographing tombstones. I'm getting the information and entering it into Ancestry. But I looked around, I thought, where are the Fields family?
Right.
In this whole cemetery, it's at the church, there were maybe 4 graves of the name Fields, 2 of whom were my grandparents. So I thought, okay. So I had to call Brother Fields, my cousin Jonas, and he gave me the name of a plantation. Totally blew my mind. Long story. It's a rice plantation. I was studying the records of that particular family that owned the plantation. I'm an academic. That's what I do. But now I'm a descendant, right? Because I have to go to this plantation and see about the Fields family. Cousin Jonas warned me that the graves were not marked. I had no idea what that meant because I'm from Miami. I thought there would be nice, neat little, squads. And there would be a little, so at least you would know, even if the family hadn't put up a tombstone, you would know who was where.
Nope.
I got out there. It was not that way at all. And the unmarked graves were just sunken in the ground. And found out that both sides of my dad's family are actually buried out there. It's not just the Fields family. So we did have graves that were marked for my grandmother's family. And one of our graves was open. And my ancestor's skull, it was full of water and his skull was floating at the top. I did not know what to do. I didn't know what to do. I didn't know what to do. And it took me about a year of not knowing and just praying and just, what am I? And then our family patriarch passed away. And he was the only one, as far as we know, who was actually in contact with the manager of that plantation to go to that cemetery. So we lost, and he's the only one who knew, because the Fields family's graves are not marked, where we were buried. And now he's gone. Oof. I say that it changed so many things about me. And it changed me wanting and sort of being satisfied writing history that was strictly academic, that was just for my colleagues and my students, graduate students. It changed me, it opened me up to finding new ways to express myself. So I wrote a libretto. I collaborated with a classical music artist, classical music composer. We wrote a symphony about slavery and rice. His people are from the Georgetown area.
Oh, okay.
So, and we're both children of the Great Migration in the Gullah Geechee diaspora. You know, it just changed so many things. The family came together and we, you know, fixed the grave. But the reason why the grave was damaged and we didn't know, and who knows how long he was in there swimming in his grave and we didn't know, those were the things that I thought we have to fix, because we left and we didn't look back.
Right.
So I'm still working on it. Yeah, I'm still working on it, but that's what changed everything. And it's interesting, I wrote about, again, in the New York Times, I still don't know where the Fields family is buried.
Okay.
I still don't know everybody who's buried out there. But what I have found, I found Hector's descendants and his siblings and his parents. I found them through the pension files. And I found death certificates, so I do know some of the Fields family members who are out there. But it just changed how the stories that I wanted to tell and the audiences to whom I wanted to tell them. Yeah.
Thank you for that.
You're welcome.
Okay, I'm coming to you.
Research on Cherokee plantation over there? Because that's what my grandparents
Are buried on Cherokee.
grandfather was born in 1875.
Okay. I have not done research on Cherokee. Cherokee was owned by the Blake family. And this is all, they had the Santee, they had the lower and the upper Combee. It's all Arthur Blake, Walter Blake, I think it's Daniel Blake up there. I have not done research on Cherokee. I've been on Cherokee, and we had our family matriarch who passed away a few years ago, cousin Katie. I'm told I have to call her Mother Katie Gilliard. This is my cousin Katie, who's said we had people buried on Cherokee. And I haven't yet been able to document that. And it could be because she's a Richards and she married into the Gilliard family. It could be she was talking about her husband's family. But I do know someone who has done some research on Cherokee that I could put you in touch with. Yeah. Any Marshall? I don't think so.
How did you find documents in Montana?
Oh, I had a team of research assistants who helped me with the book. One of whom is he's a graduate student at Carnegie Mellon. He's my advisee. He was, I call it my main storytelling research assistant. So it was his job to go out and get the details so I could tell the story. And he was working on a question I had about the Port Royal experiment, came up with a master's thesis. And in this master's thesis was a description of this diary, this May 1st, 1862, when he's writing about Harriet Tubman. And the master's thesis is about the Port Royal experiment, right? But there's this nugget about Tubman. So the citation said it was in a private collection and it's in Montana. So come to find out, his father owns the collection. And this was the middle of COVID. Everything was shut down. You know, the university had banned us all from traveling. But I was like, I'm going to Montana as soon as I can. And it was July of 2022, I think. I was on the first thing smoking. And it's a larger collection, but he donated the rest of the collection to, I think it's the Huntington Library in California, but he kept the Civil War documents because he's a Civil War buff. So I went out to Montana to see the whole collection. Okay.
Good evening, Dr. Philzlack. I am Alexis Rowan. I'm an artistic theologian. I'm visiting from Raleigh, North Carolina, and I actually came to the Combee River raid, come to know of it from the Black feminist group formed in 1974, the Combee River Collective, and their Black Feminist Manifesto.
Yes.
And so I became interested in this history through reading, through their work and understanding that. And I am very excited to read this book and to delve through your research. And I'm so excited to hear the voices of the liberated through your research. Is there a tour of the Combee River? Because I did try to Google say, hey, can you take me to the Combee River? And it keeps saying, no, can't do that. Is there a tour that's doing that? I'm really fascinated and also envious that the scholars get to have such access. I don't know how easy it is, but the scholars have access to the wealth. And I just want to, I'm curious if there's a way for the regular folk to take that journey.
There is not that I know of yet.
We're working on one.
Yeah. Part of the challenge is that the plantations are private property.
Right.
There's a total of 9 that were raided, and there's 1/2 of one that is now owned by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife. But the rest of the plantations are private property. I think personally the best way to see the raid is by water.
Yes.
I think that's the best way to see it. And so I would love to work on that.
Mm-hmm.
I would love to work on that.
I'm coming up to you, sir. Got somebody back here.
There has been a tour through USCB. I don't think it's offered all the time, but it's the adult education program. But that's what you said, that the academics get to have fun. Well, no, it's not, it's offered to the general public. Yeah.
And I'm not sure, did they start it back up after 2020? No? Yes. They did? Yeah. Okay. Okay. Which one? Okay.
There's a company here called the Beaufort Kayak Company. Mm-hmm. My family and I have been kayaking Raleigh for about 5 or 6 years. Mm-hmm. And I arranged a tour for my family to do a kayak trip on the Combee through them. Mm-hmm. And we did that in April. So
where did they take you?
We went to Yamasee. Mm-hmm. I think it's called Spring Hill Landing, I think it is. Sugar Hill Landing.
That's
in Yamasee.
not where the raid took place.
I know. The bridge that goes across is right down the river from there, though. But they take you and they introduce you to the various locks and stuff like that, the things that are on there. They go from there into the Combee.
I've done a kayak tour on Sugar Hill Landing. Sugar Hill Landing is near Cherokee, which is on the upper Combee. The raid took place on the lower Combee. So what we know now as the Harriet Tubman Bridge or the Steel City Bridge, that's where the raid ended. And it goes from there to downtown Beaufort. It does not go above that. Sugar Hill Landing is above that. And I know why people do the tours in Sugar Hill Landing, because it's an easier entree that, I call it a creek, is easier to get into. The Combee is a river. It's a serious river. I mean, these were military boats, right? They weren't ships, we've established that, but these were some pretty large ocean-going boats. So they do pull up into a creek off of Rose Hill Plantation. This is what I mentioned, Joshua Nichols. This is what he's watching. He's watching them come up the creek to his front door, basically. But these are some pretty large boats. So they're on it's pretty open, right? And it's pretty deep. It's not Sugar Hill Creek. And I've asked them to stop doing that. Because people we need the correct information. You know, in our history, we deserve what's correct. I think the challenge is, though, everybody wants to experience it, and I understand that. But I think we've got to figure out how best to do that so people can actually see where the raid took place. There's the bridge, which has a boat landing. Fields Point has a public boat landing. Downtown Beaufort has a public boat. So there are some public places, and then you go, you know, downtown Beaufort, Fields Point, Combee Ferry. And you can stop at, okay, I'm doing a tour right now, U.S. Fish and Wildlife at Bonnie Hall, their portion of Bonnie Hall, if you can get them. So I think it can be done, but we have to get it correct. You know, it has to be correct. We deserve for our history to be correct.
Eight.
Yes. Thank you. I have one little request, and this was put on my heart today as I was driving over. If there are any descendants of the Verdier family, Verdier or Sams, if anybody knows any descendants of the Verdier family, if you will ask them to call me. My cousins are depending on me to find Hector Fields, and I need their help. Okay? Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Edda Fields Black. For years, as we labored to create the Harriet Tubman Memorial and Monument to bring Harriet Tubman back to Beaufort, many times we would tell the story that Harriet came to Beaufort, and there were total denial. One thing I had was the idea and the knowledge that there was a researcher at Carnegie Mellon who was actually putting a face to those persons who were liberated in the Combee River Raid. And she worked through the years, and she has done it. And what a document it is. Thank you. If you do not have her book, it's in the next building in the fellowship hall. You want to get it tonight. No, I'm serious. A lot is going on tomorrow. There's not going to be enough books tomorrow for everyone who's going to be here. I'll tell you that right now. We're certainly glad that you came out on this night as we launched this weekend on this anniversary of the Combee River Raid for the unveiling of the Harriet Tubman Monument and the inaugural Combee Festival. We named that several years ago, but we just didn't do it because COVID came. We're not going to end it. We're going to keep coming back to Harriet and the story of Beaufort and those waterways. We were born on those waterways. We know them. That's my sister there. We know how to get up there. That's it. We know. And we're going to take them not up to Sugar Hill or Sugar Hill. Yeah. Tomorrow's certainly glad to have Ernestine Wyatt, a great great grandniece of Harriet Tubman. Just stand so they can see you. And her husband. She's on program tomorrow. The unveiling service starts at 1 o'clock, but there will be activities all day on the grounds. We have some great food vendors because that was a part of Harriet's life. We want to thank all of you for coming. Is Kate in? Karen. Is Karen in? Karen Hill? Oh, there, Karen, yeah. Another one, Karen Hill. She is the CEO and executive director of the Harriet Tubman Home. So in these two persons, you have a wealth of knowledge about Harriet Tubman. They both will be on program along with Dr. Edda Fields Black tomorrow and some others who will be coming in. We certainly encourage you now to go next door and get your book, and you can talk with her a little as she signed it. And she has persons over there who will collect your money. So when you come to her, it's a done deal. Yeah. Certainly glad to see Vanessa Seal. We went to college together, and Balm and Gilead you started, right? Balm and Gilead was a national program all over the country. That was the person who started it, Vanessa Seal, yeah. Okay, we are getting ready to close and just go next door. Give me a verse of you person, not anything. I can call on her.
Wow, okay. Good evening, everybody. He could tell me, give you a verse of everything. I could speed up that one we done do because I think it's appropriate for this evening. Oh, freedom. Oh, freedom. Oh, freedom over we. And before we be on our slaves, we going to be buried in we graves and going home till we go and be free. Amen, children. Your 100 children sound like y'all been going to the boat with the man. Going to the boat. Yes.
Almighty God, we ask that you watch over us now as we depart from this place. Protect us as we travel over the dangerous highway. We pray that God, thy blessing upon Dr. Edda Fields Black. We pray that God, thy blessings upon this her ministry. Use it to bring glory to your name and bring education and inspiration to a generation yet unborn. We thank you. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen. You can go out the front door or this door to the back, but all the books are in the next room. If you have, no, she's going over there to sign as well. If you have a book already, we'll still go next door and bring it over. You'll be first in line because the others have to buy their books as well.